Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations, a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice in Los Angeles. Features innovative experts, scholars, artists, and activists. I am Malik Moazzam Dolat, and I am a professor in the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice. And I am joined remotely by the co-organizers of the Matrix, CTSJ professors Caroline Heldman and Mary Christianakis. Today, we are honored to be joined by an outstanding scholar and activist, Hannah Appel. Professor Appel is an associate professor of anthropology and global studies at UCLA and is associate director of the excellent Institute on Inequality and Democracy that's located at UCLA. Professor Appel is co-founder and organizer, for our purposes, the most important part today, of the Debt Collective, where they organize debtors unions using an emancipatory activation of household debt under finance capitalism. Alone, our debts are a burden, but together they make us powerful. This is, how they articulate themselves on their website and their materials. Household debt leveraged collectively in the threat of a debt strike creates the power to remake contemporary financial relationships. So the first debtors union has won over $2 billion in debt abolition for people holding debt from for-profit colleges. And Professor Appel co-authored a book in 2020 entitled Can't Pay, Won't Pay: The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. Professor Appel is going to do a presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A. So the Q&A works in the way that I'm sure all of us are used to by now. There's no chat function, and raising your hand doesn't really do much here. You click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and then you can type a question in, and we'll take a look at it, and we'll get to it after the presentation. A recording of this will be available for those of you who have to cut out a little early for a job or for a class or whatever's going on our website, oxy.edu/matrix. And we'll also put it out on our social media. And with no further delay, I guess, I turn it over to Professor Appel. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Malik, and to all the CTSJ professors and Matrix conveners. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm really excited to share our Debt Collective work with you. And I guess I also just wanted to address, I'm assuming that there are some students in the audience both tonight and watching the recording, and I just wanted to say how lucky you are that you have such an intentional and thoughtful program around social justice at Oxy. It's just incredible, and it's rare. And so I hope that you know that your CTSJ professors, staff, conveners are really putting something special together for you, and I am honored to participate in it. So here we go. I think I'm going to talk for about 35, maybe 40 minutes about our work at the Debt Collective, though, as Malik said, I am also a professor, so I'm kind of wearing multiple hats, and I'm happy to respond to Q&A in multiple hats. So I'm going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes about our work at the Debt Collective and hopefully leave a nice full 20 minutes for some Q&A. Some of the presentation is going to go pretty fast. For example, I'm going to rattle off a whole bunch of statistics, and it's going to feel overwhelming. And I kind of intend it to feel overwhelming, right? I want you to just kind of let those wash over you. And if you feel overwhelmed, that's okay. That's part of the intention. And I'm actually going to get started in maybe an unpredictable place for a presentation that we're thinking is going to be about finance and debt. And that is with an image, a photograph that I took of the Critical Resistance headquarters in Oakland, California. This is a window at the Critical Resistance Oakland headquarters that gives a definition of abolition. The window says, as you can see, abolition is a strategy and a vision for a world without prisons and policing. And the window right next to it continues the definition. Abolition is the presence of housing, healthcare, education, and life free from state violence. So if you look at these two juxtaposed windows, you see in the first window pane that abolition is a vision or a strategy for a world without something, right? It's a world without prisons and policing. But abolition is also, by Critical Resistance's definition, a world with something, a world of abolitionist presence. And that is specifically the presence of housing, healthcare, education, and life free from state violence. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to kind of bookend my presentation with this definition of abolition because it's central to the work that we do at the Debt Collective. So a teacher that I have learned quite a bit from in my time, I still really think of myself as a student more than anything, Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a professor at the City University of New York, gives another definition, and she's also one of the founders of critical resistance, so it's not an accident that this is related here. She says, abolition is about abolishing the conditions under which prison became the solution to problems, rather than abolishing the buildings we call prisons, right? It's about abolishing the conditions under which prison became the solution rather than merely abolishing the buildings we call prisons. Okay, so that raises some questions for us, right? First of all, what are the conditions under which prison became the solution, right? What are these conditions that Ruthie is talking about that we need to abolish? It's one question we might ask. And I'll give you some answers that I think are the answers, right? And that I have also learned from Ruthie that critical resistance and so much of her own scholarship and activism works with. So of course, some of those conditions are anti-Black racism, white supremacy, racial capitalism. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the course of the presentation. But the conditions are also, of course, the absence of housing, healthcare, education, meaningful work, a thriving environment, right? It's not that those are entirely absent, but it's that those have been financialized. It's kind of a big word. I hope I'm going to be able to describe it to you clearly this evening, right? The financialization of housing, the financialization of healthcare, of education. What that means is that some people can enjoy full access to those things, and that's people who have all of the money to pay for an education, even an education at a public school, right? I teach at UCLA. It is what I call a formerly public school. Now tuition is very high, right? So some people can afford to pay all that. Most people go into debt for it, right? That is to say, what was formerly a public good has been financialized, right? So you have full access for those who can afford it. You have debt financed access for most households. That's true not only of education, that's true of housing, that's true of healthcare, that's even true of incarceration, as I'll show as the program goes on. And then, of course, you have banishment for the rest, right? There are some people, plenty of people, an increasing number of people who aren't even able to debt finance housing, who aren't even able to debt finance healthcare, who aren't even able to debt finance an education, right? So these are the conditions, in my opinion, that Ruthie is talking about. These are the conditions that we need to abolish in order to realize a kind of transformative vision of abolitionist presence. So the Debt Collective organizes with this broader framework in mind, because of course, one of the questions is, if we need to abolish those conditions, if we need to abolish debt financing our basic needs, how do we do that? So that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, and that's the work we do at the Debt Collective. What happens when we're forced to debt finance our basic needs? When we're forced to debt finance housing, healthcare, education? Nobody would ever say that incarceration is a basic need of anybody, but folks who are incarcerated, who touch the criminal legal system, also go into debt for that. So what I'm going to present to you tonight is an introduction to household debt and household debt resistance. Okay, so here come those promised statistics that I talked about again, just kind of let them roll over you. And one thing I want to say before I begin, I think most folks know that COVID, the last year and a half of all of our lives, has profoundly deepened economic precarity and insecurity. The statistics I'm about to give you on household debt are before COVID. So this was a profound crisis long before COVID even hit, and COVID has only made these worse in ways that we don't yet have numbers for. So 77% of US households hold consumer debt. 40% of households across this country use credit cards to cover basic living costs, rent, food, utilities, medical care. They put it on credit cards, right? The debt financing of basic needs. 62% of personal bankruptcies in the United States are linked to illness and healthcare costs. In the wake of the last economic crisis of 2008, African-American families lost 50% of their collective wealth, and Latinx communities lost a staggering 67% of total wealth. And again, we're in a moment, right, of disproportionate burden of economic precarity on Black and Latinx families, almost exactly a decade after this staggering wealth loss in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Student debt today stands at about $1.8 trillion. My family has a very small $80,000 worth of that total. Many of you may be racking up some of that total too, and others of you may have some already. Incarcerated people have an average of $13,607 in criminal legal debt alone, and this is just their court debt. This doesn't include bail debt. This doesn't include restitution. This doesn't include any of the fines and fees or paying for your own ankle monitor or your own probation, just your court debt, $13,607. 1/3 of delinquent debt is from unpaid bills, and about 1/3 of consumers report a debt in collections. And we also see, right, with all of this credit and debt swirling around people's lives, that similarly risky credit card holders of different races pay different interest rates, both across card issuers and from the same firm. So what does that mean? So I'm a white woman. Say I have a Black woman right next to me who makes the exact same amount of money I do at her job and has the exact same credit history that I do, right? Which is to say we are similarly risky in the eyes of a credit card company. She is likely to have a far higher interest rate than I am on the basis of her race, though of course credit card companies would never explain it to you like that. So what do all these statistics tell us? From education to incarceration, housing to medical care, payday loans to utility bills, household debt is at an all-time high. And again, it was already at an all-time high before COVID hit. So that helps us see that household debt is a systemic condition. It is not the individual failure of those who make poor choices in a fair system, right? This isn't like, oh, people made a bad choice about going to college. Oh, people made a bad choice about going to the hospital when they had COVID. Oh, people made a bad choice about going to jail, right? This is not about people, about financial literacy. This is not about individual choices. This is about a systemic problem. And systemic problems, systemic conditions require collective responses. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. And the first part of this presentation so far, and I'm going to go on with a little more of it, is kind of like setting the stage of the doom and gloom so that then I can talk about what kinds of collective responses are possible. So I'm going to go on with a little bit of the doom and gloom because this is an important detail to add. And I want to talk a little bit about two concepts that I think are really important and that I hope folks may have some familiarity with. And if not, I'm happy to introduce them to you tonight. And I hope you'll consider or continue to think about them. One is predatory inclusion, and the other is racial capitalism. So as I've just told you, household indebtedness is systemic, but it is not evenly distributed. I'm going to say it again. It's systemic, but it is not evenly distributed. The kinds of indebtedness that I have just narrated to you have profoundly deepened pre-existing racial and gendered inequalities in the United States, right? So before getting to that one, I'm going to say across almost every household debt type, from student debt to medical debt to carceral debt, you see that Black women hold the disproportionate burden of it. Right? This is about intergenerational wealth transfer, and it's about predatory inclusion. On what terms are Black families, Black households included in credit and debt markets? On what terms are Latinx families, are Indigenous families included in credit and debt markets, right? So predatory inclusion, here's a definition for you, where financial actors offer needed services to Black and brown households, but on exploitative terms that limit or eliminate their long-term benefit, right? So what I told you earlier about different interest rates by race, perfect example of predatory inclusion. Any of you who have read about or experienced the 2008 financial crisis, maybe lost your home, have thought about the term subprime mortgage, right? A particularly exploitative mortgage form that was offered by banks disproportionately to female-headed households and Black women-headed households in particular. Even student debt, right? For a long time, public college used to mean tuition-free college. But as the civil rights movement explodes, as on-campus activism explodes, and Black and brown students demand in, not only as members of the student body, but also to see their histories, their literatures reflected in the curriculum, you see tuition start to rise, right? And we can talk about that history if you're interested in it. It's a perfect example of predatory inclusion. You want to come into the University of California system? Well, then you have to pay, where it was free for the mostly white men before that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about student debt and carceral debt as two really good examples of predatory inclusion, of racial capitalism, which is to say of how it is that these forms of debt are at the same time systemic and not evenly distributed, right? So between 2004 and 2019, student debt quadrupled and stands today at 1.8 trillion. The average student graduated with about $30,000 worth of debt in 2018. 1 million new student debtors default every year, which is to say 1 million new people stop paying because they cannot pay. Between 1964, when the University of California, for example, was still tuition-free, and 2019, the average annual cost of attending a 4-year public college or university soared by 3,819%. So these are all, again, statistics that I haven't differentiated, right, by racial grouping. But now let's look at this. 63% of white graduates from public schools borrow. 81% of Black graduates borrow. And again, that has to do with the intergenerational dynamics of wealth transfer, right? Whose parents, given the histories of this country, are more likely to have enough money to send them to college without borrowing? 4 years after graduating from those schools, Black graduates have average loan balances more than twice that of their white counterparts. More than half of African-American households under 40 have student debt. More than half of Black borrowers and 44% of Latinx borrowers are either in default or delinquent on their loans. And when we ask why, right, a kind of conventional description would be, oh, financial literacy, right? But that's not at all it. We're looking at discrimination in the labor market. We're looking at wage gaps that are both on gender and racial lines. And we are also, as I said, looking at differentials in intergenerational wealth. As I said, my family has a tremendous amount of student debt, but my mother, right, is able to help us more than is the case for many of my Latinx friends, my Indigenous friends, my Black friends. Same thing with carceral debt, right? Debts incurred in the criminal legal system between fines, fees, restitution. Incarcerated people, as I said, have about $13,600 in criminal legal debt alone. Bail debt, especially in California, adds exponentially to that total. And what this is telling us is that the criminal punishment system, jail, prison, courts, is funded from the pockets of poor people, disproportionately Black men, because it is their fines and fees that are going into court coffers, that are going into city coffers, right? That are paying the public defender's salary. It is not tax dollars, right? This is the financialization of the carceral system. So we know African-American and Latinx men are disproportionately policed and incarcerated. And what that means is that it's often the women in their families on the outside, their mothers, their sisters, their aunties, their wives, their girlfriends, who are working to pay down these debts while also managing household costs, children, rent, food, other basic necessities. So student debt, criminal punishment debt are systemic conditions, right? They're not the individual failure of those who make poor choices in a fair system. Racial capitalism is a systemic condition. The disproportionate burden of household debt on Black, brown, and Native households is not the individual failure of those making poor choices. So again, systemic conditions require collective responses, and this is where I promise the pivot, right? What kind of collective responses are possible, right? I have just narrated the systemic problem, the unequally systemic problem of household debt to you. I hope that I have convinced you, if you didn't think about it before, that it is a systemic problem and not a financial literacy problem of individuals. So then we have to say, okay, well, what kind of collective responses are possible in this situation? And the answer the debt collective gives, that Malik said a little bit in the introduction, is debtors Unions. And this is a photograph, gosh, a pre-COVID photograph. Remember when we used to be able to like get together and have organizing meetings together in the same place? This is an organizing meeting we had with a bunch of debt collective members. Gosh, we were in Florida, and I want to say it was like 2018 or something. So it's a photograph of a bunch of debt collective members who are all part of a campaign that I'll talk to you a little bit about. So what is a debtors union? How does it work, right? Most folks have heard of labor unions. I certainly hope folks on this kind of series have heard of a labor union, but let's talk about debtors unions. The illustration that you see in front of you is a kind of classic organizing, right? A visual representation of what it means to organize. So just to talk about the illustration for a minute, on the top, we see a big fish, right? Open mouth, big fish, mean big fish. And we see all these little fish swimming away. Imagine that big fish is a debt collector, right? It's the federal government coming for your student debt. It's your parole officer calling you to pay your parole bill, right? And all the little fish, the student debtors, the carceral debtors, the medical debtors, the folks who can't afford their utility bills, their water bills, their light bills, are swimming away, disorganized, scared as hell, right? I can't pay my bill. I'm not going to pick up the phone. I'm not going to open the mail. The debt collector is after me. But if those same little fish get together and swim the other direction toward the debt collector, they are bigger. We are bigger, and we are more powerful. So that's what this slogan means at the top. Alone, our debts are a burden. Our debts make us afraid to pick up the phone. Our debts make us afraid to open that piece of mail because we know it's a bill. But together, they make us powerful. And I actually mean this in the same way that a worker alone on a shop floor, a teacher alone without a teachers union, has very little control over their workplace, right? They can go up to their boss and say, hey boss, I want better weekends. Hey boss, I want to be sure that my students wear masks. Hey boss, I need a salary raise. Or hey boss, you say there's diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff here, but really it's bullshit. And if it's one worker, right, the boss will be like, great, thanks, see you later. But if it's all workers, this is a labor union now, right? Collectively with the threat, the power that they wield is to withhold their labor, that boss has to listen. It works the same way with debtors unions. But what we can withhold is not our labor. What we can withhold collectively in an organized way, or what we can threaten to withhold, are our debt payments, right? Together, they make us powerful. So if you don't want to take that idea from me, perhaps you will take it from Mr. John Paul Getty, one of the most famous kind of monopoly capitalists of the 19th century, made a fortune in railroads and oil. And he has a famous quote that goes something like this. If you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. Like, you got to pay the fucking bank, right? Excuse my language. But if you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And what he's talking about, of course, is the power that wealthy people have with all of that debt, right? If you owe a single bank $100 million, you actually have a lot of leverage over that bank. I told you earlier that student debt alone, not to mention all the other kinds of debts I talked about, is at $1.8 trillion. We own that bank, right? But we have to organize. We don't, right? Alone, we're little fish swimming away, hoping, I mean, I'm hoping that my student debt moratorium payment, right? It doesn't kick back in and I have to make it. But if we are organized together, we have a tremendous amount of power over the very system that indebted us. So that's what we do at the Debt Collective, right? Is try to organize that debtors union. So what you're seeing here is a picture of a group that we call themselves the Corinthian 15. So Corinthian was the largest for-profit college chain in the country. And these 15 people, who were already not able to pay their student loan debt to their for-profit college, right? They were already not paying and suffering those consequences alone. Garnished wages, garnished tax return, trashed credit score, right? They were already suffering all of those consequences individually, got together in the nation's first student debt strike to say to the Department of Education, to the loan servicers, to the Genesis Lending Company, to Corinthian and ECMC, which is their accreditor for those of you who work in higher ed, we have only one thing to say. We owe you nothing, right? So they came forward to publicly declare their refusal to pay their student debts. It was turning can't pay, because remember, they already couldn't pay, into won't pay, which is the title of that book. So obviously I'm fast forwarding quite a bit here, but that nation's first student debt strike, using all kinds of tactics that are not only about a strike, and I'd be happy to talk about those in the Q&A, started to make a lot of progress. So here you see it took a couple years, but here you see about 2 years after that strike started, somebody posting on Facebook, Randy posting on Facebook, not only was Randy's student debt canceled, in other words, the future payments that she owed, here Randy is saying, I got my money back toward what I paid towards my federal student loans. And again, this is specific to for-profit colleges. And Malik read this statistic, the number that was true until about a week ago, which was that this campaign had won about $2 billion in student debt abolition for folks who held debts from for-profit colleges. But just over this last week, I don't know if any of you have seen the headlines or follow us at Strike Debt on Twitter, but we have made about $7 billion more in debt abolition off of this campaign. So now this is just from today, right? Here are folks in our Facebook group now, we just posted this yesterday, saying their reactions after having organized for years and years and seeing their student debt balances, many of which were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, drop to zero. Okay, so this campaign, this nation's first debtors union, has won a tremendous amount of victories. Some of it, right, is that $8 billion, $9 billion now back in the pockets of folks who attended for-profit colleges. Another one of the big victories here is proposed federal legislation. It's called College for All. You can see here in Washington, D.C., many of you probably recognize Ilhan Omar, Pramila Jayapal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez standing behind and to her left. But most of you probably don't know Pam Hunt, one of the member leaders at the Debt Collective on the left, Thomas Goki, same thing on the right. We, the Debt Collective Union, was invited to Washington, D.C. to announce this federal legislation. I'm not going to go through the details, but basically College for All abolishes all outstanding student loan debt. It makes public colleges free again, tuition free again. And it also, for those of us who are professors or those of us who are interested in politics and higher ed, reverses the 75-25 ratio of adjunct to tenure track colleagues and faculty. Right now, there are 25% adjunct, 75% tenure track. It would reverse that. I'm happy to talk more about College for All and where it is, but this was another one of our big wins that we were invited to DC to introduce. And I want to actually show you Pam. Now you see her with Bernie behind her. I want to make sure, am I, sharing computer sound, talking at this press conference. So here we go.
Hello, my name is Pam Hunt. I have $212,000 of student debt, $51,000 of which is interest alone. I stand before you as a person who pursued a higher degree and was made worse off because of it. I'm a proud single parent, and like so many parents, I have worked hard to make sure that my children have the best lives that they can have. I came to Washington, D.C. in 2015 as one of the first student debt strikers in U.S. history. We organized for years, and as a result, some debtors won relief, although I haven't. Over the last 4.5 years, I have struggled financially due to my student debt burden. I lost my home and nearly lost my life in a fight against cancer. But you know what I haven't lost? These illegitimate and immoral student loans that are still haunting me. You know what else I also haven't lost? I haven't lost myself or my desire to fight. I am here to fight, no matter how long it takes, for full debt cancellation and an education system that treats us with dignity and as equals. An education system that's worth fighting for. Right now, many people are not paying back their student loans because they cannot afford to. I've heard that we can't afford to let people go to school for free, but from where I stand, we can't afford not to. I have 3 daughters who, within the past 4 years, have graduated from college with Bachelor of Science degrees. Each is starting life with $50,000 plus in student loan debt. None of them are employed in their field of study, and all of them are on income-based repayment because their income doesn't afford them the ability to make monthly payments. That's just my three daughters.
Okay, there's a little bit of Pam's fire, which is so fabulous. And so now I'm just going to wrap up and move to Q&A. But what I want to say is that for a variety of reasons that I can discuss, the Debt Collective has done a whole bunch of stuff. We're known for another initiative called the Rolling Jubilee. We're actually certified as debt collectors, and we go in and buy debts on secondary markets and abolish them. But we've become well known for our work in student debt because we've had such dramatic victories with the nation's first student debtors union. And I'm happy to talk to you about, what's going on in the most present day. But the way that I want to end the presentation today is to say that the Debt Collective has never just been about student debt. The Debt Collective is about an analysis of household debt under racial capitalism, and an analysis of the kind of collective power, and in fact, the kind of collective material power we have as debtors to change this system, right? So that's not only about student debt, that's about carceral debt, that's about housing debt, that's about medical debt, that's about utility debt, that's about putting your rent or groceries or your medical bill on a credit card, right? Because you have to go into debt for your basic needs. And what I want to point out, especially to a social justice audience, is that there are all kinds of other organizations out there. Many of you may know the Red Nation, right, an indigenous socialist organization. There are many other radical activist groups out there who are also honing in on the same thing. So if you haven't checked out the Red Deal, it's kind of a socialist indigenous response to the Green New Deal. It's fabulous. Everybody should read it. But here you see in their Heal Our Bodies, reinvest in the following institutions and services, right? Free and sustainable housing, free education, free healthcare, free and accessible public education, transportation. Remember back to the abolition slides that I showed at the beginning. Abolition is a world without policing and prisons. Abolition is a world with housing, healthcare, education. How do most of us access those things right now? We debt finance them. The basic things we need in life, we debt finance. And you see abolitionist org after socialist org after radical org saying, these are the public goods, the social goods we need. They cannot be debt financed. And the Debt Collective is saying a debtors union is the method to build power to actually have leverage over those people who are indebting us. So here's the Red Nation saying it. And here, for those of us who were in the streets last summer, and I bet many of you were, this is from the Movement for Black Lives, Week of Action. Let's see, did I underline it? No, I didn't underline it. So here it is, what they demand, right? In the Movement for Black Lives, Week of Action last summer, this was the Wednesday, we demand immediate relief for our communities, that the federal government provide direct cash payments, rent cancellation, mortgage cancellation, a moratorium on utility and water shutoffs, a cancellation of student debt, student, medical, and other forms of debt. Right? We are recognizing, and one of the things that the Debt Collective points out over and over again, is debt cancellation is one of the fastest ways to close the racial wealth gap, precisely because household debts are so unevenly held. So here's Movement for Black Lives, right? That was the Red Nation. And so what I want to do now, again, now very earnestly in closing in my last 3 minutes, is to talk about some of our initiatives and ideas that are just getting off the ground. And I know some of you in this audience or who will watch this later are going to work with us on both student debt, but some of the projects that I'm about to introduce right now that bring our organizing beyond that secondary and tertiary market debt buying that we do with the Rolling Jubilee, beyond student debt, right? To try to get at the kind of many silos, to try to build power across all of these debt types. So it's looking like toward the end of October, so toward the end of next month, we're going to launch something called the Abolish Bail Debt tool. This tool, it's going to be an online app, and this is actually something we used very successfully in the student debt campaign, Ask Me How, in the Q&A, but this is a tactic that we use pretty frequently, which is we put a piece of legal mutual aid online. It is a risk-free piece of mutual aid, right? It's not like engaging in a strike. It's not like withholding a payment. It doesn't come with risk. You can use it as a free piece of legal mutual aid, and you might do it to help yourself, but then we encourage you to bring on all the other folks you know to do it. And then we reach out to you to say, hey, let's organize and do more together. So the Abolish Bail Debt tool is a tool that will work for everybody in the state of California who holds bail debt from a cosigner. Quick introduction to that. What's a cosigner? If I'm arrested and I don't want to be held in jail before my trial, right? In theory, constitutionally, we're innocent until proven guilty, but in fact, that's not the case. We are held in jail unless we have enough money to pay our bail, right? To be free before our trial. So pre-trial incarceration. If I want to be free, then I have to pay bail. The average bail amount in California, wait for it, $50,000. Now, all of you probably know that you're essentially arrested and incarcerated in this country for being poor, right? We arrest, incarcerate, criminalize poverty, even more so for Black and Brown communities. So if you don't have $50,000, which most of us don't have, then you either have to languish in jail, or you can take out a contract with a bail bonds company, a private bail bonds company. They will charge you 10%, so do your math, 10% of $50,000. They will charge you $5,000, right, that you can pay to them over a payment plan, and they will promise the court that they will go find you, right? Dog the bounty hunter, they will go find you if you don't show up at your trial, right? So then your family is going into that $5,000 of debt over time to guarantee your pretrial freedom. Most defendants, which is to say most folks who have been arrested, call a cosigner. And most folks call their mom, right? Most people call their mom, most people call their girlfriend, they call their aunt, they call their wife, right? So they call women in their family. And again, we know that Black and Brown men are disproportionately policed and incarcerated, so it is the women in their family that take on this bail debt. This tool uses a loophole in California consumer protection law, and for those of you who are like law nerds, I'm very happy to explain it more in the Q&A, to say that all cosign contracts that are now outstanding in the state of California, we think it's about $500 million worth of bail, are unenforceable because the bail bonds companies haven't been following this piece of consumer protection law. And there's actually now some legal precedent for it. So Bad Boy Bail Bonds, which is one of the biggest bail bonds company in the state, just had to pay about $4 million. And we think we can take down a whole bunch of bail bonds companies to the tune of about $500 million. So this tool and the campaigns that it's going to generate, which I'm excited to talk more about, is going to launch at the end of October. And then the tool through which I originally met Malik, at least in my brain, Malik, this is how I think we met, is also about to launch very soon, tragically, because the California Eviction Moratorium is about to expire or sunset the last day of this month, September 30th or 31st. And so October 1st, so many tenants across the state, tenants are folks who rent, right? You're a tenant and a landlord. So many tenants are going to be served with eviction notices for non-payment. So we have, well, the first thing I'll say before I talk a little bit about the Tenant Power Toolkit, a tenants union, some of you may belong to the LA Tenants Union. If you don't belong to the LA Tenants Union, I encourage you to go out and find out about them. We've built this tool in concert with the LA Tenants Union and the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and also with the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, where I work at UCLA. A tenants union is one of the best known forms of a debtors union. Huh? What does that mean? Why is a tenants union a debtors union? A tenants union is a debtors union because the power tenants have collectively over their landlords, right, is the power to withhold rent. If I withhold rent from my landlord, right, and say, hey, I told you I really needed you to fix the fan, or I really needed you to fix the light and you're not doing it and I'm withholding rent, my landlord says, fine, you're evicted. But if all of us in all of the landlord's buildings withhold rent in an organized way, right, in concert, think of the big fish, little fish diagram, we actually have a tremendous amount of power over that landlord. So in a moment where millions of households across not only the state of California, but the entire country are about to face a huge wave of eviction, we've built something called the Tenant Power Toolkit. It's complicated, there are a lot of parts of it. I'm really happy to talk about it, and I'm happy some of you will come work with us on it. But in short, it will provide The first thing that it provides is any tenant who is served with what's called an unlawful detainer, which in general is just an eviction sentence, right? Most tenants get these pieces of legal paper and they're like, oh, I don't know how to respond to this. It's in complicated legal language, often not in the language that they speak. They say, I can't respond to this. The first thing that the Tenant Power Toolkit does is, for now in Spanish and English, and hopefully when we get more funding in more languages, it allows any tenant or any tenant group or any family or any church group or mosque group to, on a phone or on a computer, respond to an unlawful detainer, right? Respond to eviction papers. And if you're anywhere in LA County, file your eviction defense directly with the court without having to go down to the courthouse. It also works across the entire state of California, but in other jurisdictions outside of LA County, we haven't figured out the electronic filing yet. I can tell you why if you're curious. So, but just the act of being able to respond to an unlawful detainer then actually gives tenants a fighting chance of staying in their homes, right? It means they don't have to self-evict. It means that they can demand a jury trial. And the data shows that when tenants demand a jury of their peers, which often includes other tenants, they have a way better chance of staying in their home. And then we link them with local tenants unions, we link them with local legal service providers, and then we have a whole set of kind of questions and forums to help folks with their back rent debt, because many of us, perhaps many of you, many of your families, right, were not able to pay rent during COVID because folks lost so much income. And so now there's this whole wave of back rent debt, again, across California, but across the country, that the Tenant Power Toolkit will also address. So those are some of our projects, efforts that are coming online shortly that I'm so excited that some Oxy students will join us with. And I am going to go ahead and end there with this slide just to say, here are some ways to learn more. Here are some ways to join us. The Alone Our Debts Are a Burden, Together They Make Us Powerful. Join the union. That's just our homepage. You're welcome to sign up and join the union. You can pay member dues. You can also just join at $0 a month. That is a still of the front of our book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay. It's available on an ebook for like $4 at Haymarket. And I think as a print copy for about $12. We also just recently made a film, which you see in the bottom left-hand corner. Astra Taylor is another co-founder. She's a filmmaker. And we just made a film that's available for free on The Intercept, and it's called You Are Not Alone. So I invite you to read these things by yourselves, read them in your classes, use the film as a teaching tool, or use it in some of your own kind of personal political education that you're doing in your autonomous groups. And thank you so much for your time, and I'm excited for your questions.
Oh, fabulous, thank you. That was amazing and very clear, given that is in fact how we met, Hannah. Was working on that tool and trying to get it distributed a year and 6 months ago, something like that. And I know how complicated putting that together was, and getting it to be simple and smooth is really something else. So we have a few questions now, but I'm going to encourage everyone to ask any question that you think is relevant, anything that you want more information on, and then we'll go through as many of them as we can. So one of the things that's going to happen is we have a class called Justice Bootcamp, and our students will be volunteering for different organizations and different causes, and they'll be volunteering here. For those of you interested in that, this is specific now, who knows how long this video will live, but this is, all of these, the bail debt, housing debt and eviction crisis tool, and then obviously student debt cancellation are campaigns that you have. So maybe we can just be for a moment to spur some of these questions, although there's two philosophically interesting questions in the Q&A we'll get to in a second. Maybe you can just say a little bit more about what kinds of things students can do. We do have a anonymous attendee who asked that question. What kinds of work you imagine them doing in each of those? So let's just say anyone watching wants to volunteer with a debt collective. What are the things that you can do if you don't have the kind of expertise, organizing background, and training?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I really appreciate that, like, very straightforward and wonderful question, right? I want to get involved. How can I help? What can we do? What I would suggest is going to the website and signing up to become a member of the union. Again, this does not require you paying any money. It doesn't require you paying any dues, but it onboards you to a couple things, including a new member welcome call. including, about twice or 3 times a week, we have different calls that tell folks how they can get involved with the different campaigns. We also have our own political education program. So you can know when we host webinars like this that might be specifically about carceral debt, or might specifically be about climate debt, or when we're about to launch the housing tool, right? That the housing organizer is going to come on and talk with the LA Tenants Union about that collaboration. So by joining the union, you kind of get into the ecology of the debt collective, and then you can kind of choose your own adventure about how in you want to be. We also have local chapters, branches. We're just kind of starting that up because debtors share creditors. We don't share factory floors. So it's interesting to think about how place-based organizing does and doesn't work, right? Productively different from worker organizing, but you can absolutely join a local branch. There are all kinds of local initiatives because we've been so successful around student debt. For folks that pay attention to kind of DC social media, folks know that there's a real chance that student debt is going to get canceled. So lots of folks, lots of debt collective members are organizing to get their local municipalities or even state governments to pass resolutions that they're in support of student debt cancellation, right? There's all kinds of ways to plug in. So the kind of your portal to all of those is just going to the website, signing up to become a member. So you'll start getting emails and notifications about political education, member onboarding calls, your local branch, stuff like that.
Okay, so this is a really odd kind of question to ask. But oftentimes with these kinds of big structural and systemic problems, the idea that activism is going to have some kind of immediate impact is a bit optimistic, right? But as you just said, the student debt cancellation and even the eviction debt cancellation seem genuinely realistic, right? Maybe not likely, but realistic. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be too crazy about it, but can you just say something before I come to these next two questions about what has changed?
Yeah.
Like, why is this possible?
It's such a good question. So the debt collective, including me, we got our start during Occupy Wall Street. So I was a postdoc in New York when Occupy Wall Street kicked off, and many of us who went on to organize this group met there. So my history of why this is possible starts in 2011, which is not to say, obviously, that economic justice organizing, that analyses of racial capitalism, none of that starts in 2011, right? All of that, I mean, whatever, we could go back into that history. And in fact, we do in the book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, right? Back to the Haitian Revolution. But in 2011, so many people who came to Occupy Wall Street came there, why? Because they couldn't afford their mortgage and their home was taken from them. Because they had graduated from college and they had $50,000 worth of student debt, and they really thought they wanted to get a master's degree because they wanted to be a journalist, but then they knew they would have $75,000 more, and then they have $130,000, right? I mean, folks were there because they were indebted. They were in weird internship jobs that didn't give them healthcare, and so anytime they went to the hospital, they had to go to the emergency room, and they got, a bill for $5,000 that they couldn't pay. So debt became this kind of organizing principle. Rest in power, David Graeber. Debt became this organizing principle of Occupy Wall Street and of the financialization of daily life, for those of you who like to nerd out about these things. Student debt hit $1 trillion in the year 2011. We were in New York, we staged a march, we called it 1T Day. And because the press was paying attention to Occupy Wall Street and there were hundreds of people in the streets for 1T Day, the liberal media came. NPR came, Reuters came, and you know what they did when they covered us? They made fun of us. They were like, these people want their debts canceled and they think college should be free. As if, right, total historical amnesia that public college actually used to mean tuition-free college. And now, fast forward a mere 10 years to 2021, and literally everybody across the political spectrum in the most recent presidential election had to have a position on student debt. Right? Even if you're all the way on the far, far right, you have to have a position around student debt. So to me, now that's 10 years of like tireless, crazy organizing, but that's only 10 years. That's a blink, right? Abolition itself, the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade is like a 50-year movement. It's a 50-year movement. So I think, the kind of systemic change we're looking for, which is not only debt cancellation, but also the power of a union to say, we don't just want these debts canceled, we want the system changed on the other end so that it doesn't happen again. If all my debt gets canceled, but college is still too expensive, then the next generation is just going to go into debt again. We won't have made that systemic change, right? So the power of the union has to be not only for debt abolition, but also for a new way to resource basic needs. So I actually think that and now we can get really nerdy about like modern monetary theory and about who has been in the Congressional Budget Office. But I think that some of that understanding that neoliberalism, that financialization has been a mistake and has drastically indebted families such that they have no social safety net whatsoever, right? The only social safety net folks have is their credit card. That came to light in the coronavirus pandemic. And the government was forced, lest everybody be kicked out of their apartments and get COVID and die, to be like, oh, wait, you actually don't have to pay your rent. Oh, wait, you actually don't have to pay your student debt, right? This word moratorium came into our vocabulary. And before it was like, everybody has to pay their debts. You have to pay your debts. Surprise. It turns out that you don't, and it's going to be okay. And maybe we can negotiate about it. So that's how I would narrate some of the context.
Okay, so let's combine two questions. So Alexander Wolf, who's pursuing a PhD and whose dissertation is about debt, is running a reading group at Oxy. He's an Oxy grad. And we just read Graeber and Lazzarato and some other people on sort of ontological conditions of debt. Asks a great question here. You can read it, but I'll read it for everybody else. You've written that one of the upsides to debtor organizing is that, unlike worker organizing, there have not been decades of class war aimed to suppress the tactic. End of the quote. Are you witnessing any fresh attempts to suppress the tactic of collective debt refusal or debt organizing? And as if on cue, we get this question: if student debts are eliminated, who is paying for these cancellations?
Great. Okay, so I'll take them in that order. So Alex, I would say no, still. Because a debtors union is not yet a legal form in the way that a workers union is a legal form, right? And that comes with its own very serious drawbacks and problems. And it may, in fact, eventually be that a debtors union will have to have a legal form with all kinds of legislation around it, both to protect it, but also, of course, from its detractors to try to weaken it. But right now, it's still more of a kind of a strategy and a tactic, and it's still much more insurgent. And so I think we don't see kind of organized opposition to debtors unions, because most people would still be like, what the fuck is a debtors union? Excuse my language, right? But what we do see is that we come and make the demands, okay, college, there has to be student debt abolition. And then on the other side, there has to be free college for all. And so then we get this bill proposed, college for all, and then we see them whittle away at it, right? Like, we won't make all previously public colleges free, but we'll make 2 years of community college free, right? That's a recent thing that happened in the infrastructure bill, the education piece of the infrastructure bill. They took out the 75-25 adjunct tenure track, right? So those aren't tactics that are specifically directed at debtors unions, but it is to say that when we have kind of what feel to us, of course, like massive wins, right? Like federal legislation and the strikers introducing federal legislation with Bernie Sanders in DC, then of course, Ruthie always says, you have to organize for the day after victory, right? You feel it's a victory, and it is a victory, and we have to acknowledge those victories, but then they will try to dismember it. That's a little too graphic, but they will try to kind of take it apart piece by piece, and you have to be there to push for it. So the short answer to your question is not yet. And I think the yet is very important. And because you're a PhD student, I just want to direct you to the Law and Political Economy blog that comes out of Yale. Somebody just wrote a piece there that was kind of a provocation about other forms of unionism in response to the current capitalist moment. And they wrote about like a legal recognition for tenants unions. So that's another piece that kind of pushes the thinking there. And to the second question about who will pay for it, the wonderful thing about student debt cancellation, which is slightly different from other forms of debt cancellation, is that student debt, I want to say it's like 98%, I forget the exact percent, but it's like higher than 95, is held by the federal government. The federal government is the lender. The federal government is the collector. The federal government is the regulator. So nobody has to pay for student debt cancellation. Joe Biden, even without congressional approval, can simply say, student debt is canceled. So for example, that $9 billion of student debt cancellation from for-profit college students, there was no higher taxes raised to pay for that. It's just zeroed out in the budget of the federal government, right? So just like when the federal government decides, the Pentagon says, we want a budget of 5 trillion, and and Congress says, actually, here's 7, don't worry about it. Did they come to us and say, hey, we need to raise your taxes because we're going to give the Pentagon trillions more? No, they didn't, right? They just give the Defense Department that money. They give the Pentagon that money. Same thing here. And we actually have the executive order written for Joe Biden. If you go to Twitter @StrikeDebt, you can read the legal authority that the president has. He can do it with Congress too, but he can do it without Congress. It's a power vested in the president in the Higher Education Act. So in a beautiful way, nobody has to pay for it. But what's happening now is that the entire economy is paying for it because folks who hold these student debts, again, disproportionately Black and brown, not buying houses, not starting families, right? It's really holding folks back. So there's a way now, I would say, that we're paying for it in a way that we wouldn't have to. We'd see a kind of spike in economic growth, if that's a concern for some people, if the debts were to be canceled.
Okay, so that's a tremendous answer. So a real quick question is just a follow up. That 1.8 trillion in debt, that does it not include accrual of interest?
That is such a good question. Is it just principal or is it also interest? So in student debt comes with compound interest. So compound interest means that every month, if you don't pay both the principal amount that you owe and the interest that you owe, the interest is added to the principal, right? That's a special kind of interest called compound interest. It's not always the case. And so that 1.8 trillion includes any interest that has compounded into the principal. So in effect, it does include interest. It's just probably not, say, like the last couple months of interest haven't been added to that, but as it compounds, it's added to the total.
But it's also not projecting, let's say in 2050, what people's student loan debt burden will be, right? Yeah.
Oh my gosh, no, and it will be extraordinary. The other thing about the interest rate, for those of you who are like macro nerds out there, if there are any of you, is that interest rates right now are at historic lows, which is to say the price of money, the price of borrowing money, like to borrow money to go to college, is at like so low, below 2%, sometimes a little above 2%. My student loans are at a 7% interest rate, 7%, and it compounds. We, and I'm just using my family here, first as an example of how important it is to be able to talk about our debts openly, right? We have been paying over $500 a month, gosh, since we could start affording it, which is like when we got jobs after graduate school, and our balance has gone up.
Yeah.
We pay over $500 a month, and our balance has only gone up. We started with 65,000, and now we have 85,000. And we pay $500 a month.
Yeah. So we'll end on this. Kate Stout is a student at Occidental College. Asked a great question here, and let me combine it with something, and maybe we can take the last 2 or 3 minutes. So Kate's question is: please speak more on the tuition increase after cultural expansion of access to public college curriculum. There's an interesting element that I think Debt Collective and Institute on Inequality brought up, which was the way that the rent debt was being turned into consumer debt also ensures in a way that people's credit scores will be worse and they won't be able to get loans, get financing, and rent another apartment. So in a way, it's a tool of oppression, directly in this regard. So I just want to tie this together. If you want to say something to Kate's excellent question that probably requires reading 10 books.
No, it does not require reading 10 books, thankfully. I think I have a soundbite for it. Okay. One thing I will say is that I did what I think is a completely ridiculous series of very short videos, like 2-minute explainers, and we have one of them on these. It's called the Debt Mom series, but if you look for the Debt Collective's video YouTube channel, that's what those things are called, you can see the entire series, and there's one on this, but the short story, and hopefully for profs out there, they're useful in your classes. The short story, as so many of these short stories do, begins with Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, before he was the president of the United States, was the governor of California. Ronald Reagan comes to be the governor of California in the 70s, in the wake of the civil rights movement, which across California, right? Merritt College, Oakland, home of the Black Panthers, UC Berkeley, home of the free speech movement. I mean, there are colleges all across the country. But in California, where conservative Reagan is coming to be governor, the 1960s saw college campuses explode with anti-imperial movements, right? About the Vietnam War, with feminist movements, with Black Power, with the Brown Berets, with all of that, right? And college campuses were a place where that kind of collective speech and then radical thinking was repressed, but certainly it could happen more, arguably, than in other places. So Ronald Reagan's governorship in the 1970s, he literally says, if these students, note the phrase, these students, if these students want to come into these institutions, they will think twice before they go to college to carry a picket sign if they have to pay. That is almost a direct quote. I don't remember the direct quote off the top of my head. So literally in response to campus uprising, in response to the refusal of the historically white colleges and universities that our UC system was and that the community college system was, Ronald Reagan says, okay, you want in, then pay. He becomes the governor of California. The UC system starts the nationwide trend of charging tuition, just as Black and Brown and women, Black and Brown students, women are getting into these schools, which historically had primarily been for white men, right? And it was tuition free when it was for them. Ronald Reagan says you have to pay. And of course, we also associate him with a kind of beginning of a certain kind of neoliberalism, and it spreads across the country. And then lo and behold, he becomes the president. But what you actually see, because of that very recent history, it probably doesn't seem recent to many of you, but it's very recent history, is that student debt doesn't accumulate in a statistically meaningful way until 1999. It's too insignificant to measure until 20 years ago, which tells us it was a policy mistake, and it is a policy mistake that can be changed, period. Now, in terms, Malik, the last thing that you asked about the conversion of rent debt into consumer debt, I wonder if most folks in the audience know this, but so one of the things that kind of a California progressive legislature did was to say, it used to be obviously that if I didn't pay my rent, my landlord could come kick me out and be like, bye, you're evicted. But during COVID, legislation passed that said, if you are unable to pay your rent during COVID, it's not grounds for eviction. And the way they did that was by converting it from what used to be kind of debt to your landlord to what's called consumer debt, right? So just like your auto bill, your utility bill, your medical debt, your student debt, but not exactly because that's owed to the federal government. Still owed to your landlord, but not grounds for eviction. But exactly as Malik says, now there are families that are carrying around $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 in debt that they will never be able to pay. There has been a promise from the governor of 100% landlord bailout that to date, the bureaucratic rollout has been a disaster. Maybe it'll get better, we don't know. Everybody will not be eligible for it. And we do know that the bureaucratic rollout will be very choppy. And we know that it's certainly not going to happen before October 1st, which is when people are going to start getting evicted for non-payment of rent. So that is precisely a timeline that the Tenant Power Toolkit is set up to respond to hope to be able to get as many tenants as possible to be able to file an answer to their unlawful detainer to say, wait, I applied for this money, I haven't heard from it, you can't kick me out yet because I'm still waiting to see if my landlord is going to be bailed out. But you're absolutely right, Malik, that any of that debt that they accrued will still be owed to their landlord if their landlord isn't bailed out. And yeah, it will trash their credit score. They can get, depending on where it goes in their financial lives, they can get wages garnished for it. They can get tax returns garnished for it. They also don't have consumer protections. It's consumer debt without consumer protections because landlords aren't regulated as debt collectors. So their landlord can call them all hours of the day and night. The landlord can call their place of business. I mean, it's going to be a shit show that we are trying to organize in response to with the LA Tenants Union, with ACE, with all kinds of folks now with the Tenant Power Toolkit.
Well, thank you for giving us something to do while you told us how terrifying things are. I'm going to send this to Professor Appel, this last question, by email. Megan's one of our students, and we'll get an answer to that by email or by conversation. Okay. Oh, you're typing. Wonderful. Okay. Okay. So that's so wonderful. And thank you for your time and for your excellent presentation and for giving us, some direction on this. We'll be in touch further. And what we'll do is we'll go out to our registration list and on our social media and our YouTube with all the links that you mentioned, including we'll try to be affiliated. What is it called? There's a way you do this. Subscribe to the Debt Mom
yeah.
stream, so our students can be involved. But thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to working with you, hopefully for the long term as we take on these things.
Absolutely. We'd love that. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. Thank you for being here. Take care and have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.